What's up, everybody? Something really, really cool for you today. I'm very excited about this one because I think it's an amazing example of how the Old and the New Testaments interact with one another. And I think that really this is so important because often we want to separate out the two testaments and we forget that they're part of the larger holistic story. They are connected in a way that they cannot really be separated. And I think we'll see this in this study. And it really hinges, this specific example, on the broader study of typology, which, if you don't know what that is, essentially it is the study of how an event, an object, a person, a story, or whatever from the Old Testament points to and prefigures something to come in the New Testament. Often these things hinge on the person or the work of Jesus Christ, and our story today is no exception. I think that the study of typology is so interesting and so important because, and personally I just love it so much, because it doesn't offer you a new teaching or a new understanding, but it offers you a new depth of understanding, a new appreciation for what God has done. And I think that it is a proof text for God and His divine work in writing out His Word, because it really takes someone who knows the end from the beginning in order to kind of put all of this in the Bible. Now, when you study typology and you look at the Old Testament event, person, object, whatever, and then you look at the New Testament fulfillment of that, often it's so obvious. You're like, well, of course that's what that is. And yet, when you look at the people fulfilling it, it's obvious that there's no collusion. They're not just acting something out. They are living, and somehow God works it into such a way that the Old and the New Testaments are brought together. And it often takes a certain study. It's like you have to focus your eyes a certain way in order to see it. And so that's how you know that this can't just be the work of mankind. This is the work of a God who did absolutely know the end from the beginning and was working out His scripture, not only in inspiring words from people, but inspiring world events and inspiring their lives. And I just think this is so incredible. And we're going to start our story in Luke 22. We're going to go to the New Testament portion of this story first, then go back to the Old Testament. So if you remember, towards the end of Jesus' life, He has a meal with His disciples. We call it the Last Supper, but it is also just a Passover meal that He's eating with them. And typically, the Passover meal would have been a slaughtered lamb that they were eating with bitter herbs. And you can find this all in Exodus 12. And it was very important to the nation of Israel. But when Jesus is eating this last Passover meal with His disciples, He institutes some new symbols that are really, really important because they're pointing to something that's about to happen in His arrest and His torture and His execution. In verse 19 of Luke 22, these are the new symbols. It says this, "And He took bread, and when He had given thanks, He broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, 'This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood.'" So remember these two things, bread and wine. These are things we need to remember. And also, I want you to remember this middle part here where he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 says that Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," of both the bread and the wine. So he says it kind of at the conclusion of these things. It says, "In the same way, also He took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" So 3 really important things here. 1, the bread. 2, the wine. And 3, the remembrance. Now, if we look back at the Old Testament then, in Genesis 40, this is smack dab in the middle of Joseph's story, which I think is so interesting because on so many levels, Joseph acts as a type of Jesus Christ. That's a whole separate study, but just to give you some examples, Joseph was betrayed by his brothers. Jesus Christ was betrayed by one of His apostles, as close as a brother. Joseph was sold into slavery by his enemies, to his enemies by his brothers, and Jesus was given into the hands of the Pharisees who sought to kill Him. Joseph had a coat of amazing colors, representative of regality and royalty, and Jesus had the glory of God before He came down to earth. And Joseph had this coat stripped from him and became a slave and a servant. Jesus willingly gave up His glory to come to earth and act as a servant to mankind. So a lot of types here, a lot of interesting points that match up line for line. So the entire life of Joseph, in a way, prefigures what Christ was going to do for us. But there's a really interesting subsection here in the middle of Joseph's life that I think shows this on a whole other level. And what's really interesting too is Jesus' story is known as the greatest story ever told, and Joseph's story in literary circles is also known as the greatest story ever told. Even atheists and skeptics who don't really have any sort of spiritual appreciation for the Bible will look at the story of Joseph and say, it is expertly told. It is incredibly well done. If only they could see that about Jesus' life as well. But I think it's just so cool that there is an appreciation for this Joseph story that even people who are antithetical towards the Bible do find some appreciation in, and that could be a really cool way to point them to Christ and say, look, the same thing was done over here. So in chapter 40 of Genesis, Joseph finds himself in prison, and he's imprisoned wrongfully for something he did not do. But he receives some sort of authority and freedom even within the prison. The guards notice that he's a good person, he's an organized person, he can be trusted, and so he's given a certain measure of leeway in this prison, and we'll see what that affords him, what opportunity that affords him right here. In chapter 40, verse 1, it says, sometime after this, meaning after Joseph was thrown in prison, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. Now, often people want to ask, what did these two do to be thrown in prison? And we don't really know. The Bible doesn't tell us explicitly. Often tradition will say they tried to assassinate him, or at least one of them did, and they weren't sure who it was, so both of them were thrown in jail while an investigation took place. We're not told, but either way, they are in prison. Hopefully you've noticed something, though. These two people are described as a cupbearer and a baker. And we'll see just how intricately connected this is to the New Testament in just a second, because it's not just positions in an office. This is actually, I do believe they had these positions in this office, but this is also symbolism of something that was to come in the New Testament, and they didn't even know it. They weren't even aware of it. So one night they're in the prison. I'm just going to summarize here for a second. They're in the prison and they both have dreams. And they're distressed because not only were they not the greatest dreams, but they don't know what they mean. They're looking back to their life in Pharaoh's castle or, the palace, where they're able to go to magicians and diviners and get their dreams told to them. And now they've just had these dreams, but there's no one to interpret. And so they are downcast. And Joseph actually asked them, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We've had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So Joseph's going to interpret their dreams, and he's had a long history of dreaming and interpreting dreams in his life. So this is nothing new for him. It seems to be a gift that God has given him, or that God works through him. So I'm not sure how Joseph knew that he could do this, but it seems like he was aware that he had some sort of ability that God had given him, and he does give credit to God, which is important. But in verse 9, the chief cupbearer steps up first, and he tells the dream to Joseph. He says, "In the dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into the cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly, when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." So here's the cupbearer's dream, and it is a favorable interpretation. He's going to be released, whether he's found innocent or just given some sort of pardon, we're not sure, but he's going to be released. And did you notice the wine? So there's wine in the New Testament. That's one of the symbols we were trying to remember. And we have this cupbearer dreaming of wine that he presses into the cup. But this is a favorable interpretation. This is a good thing. In the New Testament, remember, it represents the blood of the new covenant spilled out for us. Then in verse 16, the baker gets a little bit more emboldened when he hears the favorable interpretation. He says, okay, I wonder if he heard some sort of similarity between his dream and the cupbearer's dream. They both have 3s in them. And so he's emboldened. He thinks, maybe I'll get a favorable interpretation too. And so he tells the dream. He says, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. Cannot imagine telling this man this interpretation, but Joseph did. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. So this is the interpretation of the baker. Now we have the bread symbolized in this, which is really interesting. Remember, in Jesus' time, when he's breaking the bread, that bread represents his body, which is broken for us. In verse 20, we have the fulfillment of both of these interpretations. It says, on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. What's so amazing here is that in Jesus' time, the bread is the body of Jesus Christ that is broken for us. So the baker, his body is also broken. He dies. But the cupbearer ends up living. He is restored to his old position. He has new life. He goes from the pit of prison into a resurrected life in the palace again. And he is representative of the wine. And what does the wine do in the New Testament? It's the blood of the new covenant spilled for us to offer us new life. But remember that 3rd thing that I said we have to recall, and that is the fact that Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me. Remember, he asked the chief cupbearer, when you go to the palace, please don't forget me, but recall my name to Pharaoh, plead my innocence. And here it says in the last verse, a really interesting warning to us, I believe, in verse 23, yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And so it's all well and good that Jesus Christ died for us, that his blood was spilled for us to give us new life. But we have to remember him, unlike the chief cupbearer did. This is the overwhelming lesson, and this is what we have to do different as we actually get to be participants in this typology. We are types of the cupbearer, but we can be better types because instead of forgetting what Jesus Christ has done, we can rehearse it daily, dying to ourselves and living for him, appreciative of what he's done for us.